All right. I was just on a forum, actually. I figured I'd ask a few of my trusty atheist friends what they dislike about arguments for the resurrection. I'm getting a lot of Hume, and people find that the Hume argument against miracles is very convincing. I find it very unconvincing myself.
Yep.
Um, to clarify, the Hume argument is that miracles are extremely improbable. Anything is more probable than a miracle. So if you can fit any other story that is not miraculous into that picture, then that story is more probable than the miraculous one. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So for that, I would just simply say, well, how are you calculating probability? Because it seems to me that if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, then his resurrection becomes 100% probable. So in what sense do you think a miracle like the resurrection is improbable? Well, the only other option, since if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, it would be very probable. The other option would be that you give the hypothesis that Jesus was raised by natural causes. And I would agree, that's extremely improbable. It's impossible. Um, but we wouldn't call that a miracle, would we? Um, if God's not involved in it, we wouldn't call it a miracle. And so that doesn't make sense to say that a miracle in that sense is improbable, since if we're saying it's by natural causes, it wouldn't be a miracle. So again, in what sense is it improbable, and how are you calculating it to be improbable? Put the onus on them.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the rebuttals to that was basically just, is it really something that we should, is it a stance you can really take towards the situation that God just wanted to do that? Or is that something that's just going to be like in the mind of a believer? Because a lot of people don't start as believers with this evidence. They want to be convinced to be believers, but you kind of have to already be a believer to be convinced of that. What would you say to a person who had that sort of a rebuttal?
I'd say that's doing things backward. We have to look at the evidence for the event itself, and say, okay, what kind of evidence do we have, for this event, miracle or non-miracle? What kind of evidence do we have? Does the evidence suggest that it occurred? And we determine that by looking at various hypotheses and seeing which hypothesis best explains the data. And the data would be things like Jesus died by crucifixion. Second, that shortly after his death, a number of his followers had experiences in both individual and in group settings they were convinced were appearances of the risen Jesus to them. That's not to say that Jesus actually appeared to them, but their experiences were of such a nature that they sincerely believed Jesus rose and appeared to them. And then third, there was a skeptic, a persecutor of the church named Paul, who likewise had an experience he was convinced was an appearance of the risen Jesus to him, and it transformed his life to becoming a believer. So now what the historian has to do is come up with the best explanation, the explanation that best accounts for all of those facts, not just one of them, but all of them. And the resurrection is the only one that can do that. So that's how historical investigation is done. So, then you'd say, okay, the evidence we have suggests Jesus rose from the dead. Then Hume comes back and says, yeah, but a miracle is the least likely explanation. To which I say, least likely in reference to what? Because if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, then it becomes the most probable explanation, not the least probable explanation. So in order to show it's the least probable explanation, you have to show that God does not exist, or that if God exists, he would not want to raise Jesus. The burden of proof goes on the one who says Jesus didn't rise from the dead, because the historical evidence suggests that he did. So it's the skeptic here who is trying to impose his or her own worldview biases on this. And just like they're going to say we're biased, no, we're looking at the historical data. They're the ones that are bringing their biases into the discussion. And we should not always be on the defense. We have good evidence for what we believe in terms of the resurrection of Jesus. Put them on the defense.
That's good. What would you say to somebody, and not to just give you 1,000 questions, but I
That's all
figured
right.
I'd ask
That's what I'm
this.
here for.
What would you say to somebody who said something to the effect of that the prior probability of the historical evidence doesn't give a sufficiently high likelihood to the ratio? Let's just say they set their priors a lot lower than maybe somebody in your position would, even though you are an experienced historian. Is there any way you could kind of jack that up for them? Other things that you could kind of add to the cumulative case?
Well, first of all, Bayes' theorem is not something that historians use. You have Richard Carrier that uses it. You have another guy, Abiezer Tucker, is a philosopher of history. He teaches at Harvard. Other than those two, I don't know of any historians, practicing historians or philosophers of history, who think Bayes' theorem is a legitimate way of approaching historical investigation. And I would also say that Bayes' theorem, and the reason a prior probability doesn't work well here, um, it's very subjective, and it doesn't work well in historical investigation. So, for example, what's the prior probability? Let's take another historical event. What's the prior probability that the U.S. dropped nuclear bombs on Japan in World War II? Now, notice I'm not asking what's the probability based on the evidence that we have that the US dropped nuclear bombs on Japan in World War II. I'm asking what's the prior probability that the US dropped nuclear bombs on Japan in World War II? Well, such is inscrutable. There's no way to figure out what the prior probability is that the US dropped nuclear bombs on Japan. Similar in science. What's the prior probability of black holes? Well, you can't calculate that because black holes are theoretical entities posited to explain observable phenomena. We've never observed a black hole. We probably never will. What we do observe are certain phenomena, and we posit the theoretical entities, such as black holes, quarks, strings, gluons. We posit them to explain the observable phenomena. In history, hypotheses are posited to explain data, existing data. So prior probabilities don't necessarily work here. Now, of course, if the prior probability is that an alien posed as the Son of God, a very powerful alien posed as the Son of God and tricked us all by rising from the dead, well, then we might be able to deal somewhat with a prior probability there. We might be able to say, well, the closest planet to us that's even possibly uh, uh, capable of sustaining intelligent life is 23,000 light years away. At least that's what Hugh Ross told me. And he said that even if they built a spaceship that could travel at the speed of light, it would still take 23,000 years to get here. And given all the radiation in space and the space debris, it would be impossible for them to arrive at Earth safely. So, based on that, I could say, well, the prior probability that Jesus was an alien from another planet coming to deceive us, that prior probability would be extremely low. So the only way that they're going to be able to show that there's a prior probability against the resurrection would be to say that God doesn't exist, or they have to give arguments that God doesn't exist, or some reason for thinking a priori that he would not want to raise Jesus from the dead. And that's going to be really difficult to do on the second, and they haven't been able to succeed in doing that on the first. Now, if I wanted to raise a prior probability, I suppose I could, and that would just be the plausibility criterion. I could give some evidence for God's existence, or at least for an intelligent designer of the universe, such as, intelligent design arguments, of course. Could also talk about something like the Kalam cosmological argument. I might be able to give a moral argument for God's existence. And historically speaking, I could show that Jesus did come on the scene, claiming to have a special relationship with God who had chosen him to usher in his kingdom. I could also argue that Jesus performed deeds that astonished crowds and that both he and his followers regarded divine miracles and exorcisms. That's not to say that these scholars would say that they were divine miracles and exorcisms, but that they were of such a nature that crowds were just totally amazed by these and interpreted them as these things. So if Jesus is making such claims, he's performing these deeds, this all creates a context that is charged with religious significance. And when you combine that with arguments for God's existence, I think you could, if you're looking at doing a prior probability, which I would just simply call the plausibility criterion, then you could develop somewhat of a prior probability in that sense. But again, this is something that historians just don't do, because in many cases, the prior probability is just subjective and is unknowable.
Understood. We have some more questions in the chat. John Lloyd Bautista, I don't know I'm going to butcher everybody's name. I apologize. He asks, Dr. Mike, you had a debate with Richard Carrier before. Carrier argues that there are 4 so-called naturalistic theories of how the first Christians came to believe Jesus was raised from the dead. Carrier said that the survival argument is the most possible explanation for Jesus rising from the dead. How do you respond to such a claim?
Well, why don't explain that survival argument, because I'm not familiar with it.
I would guess it's the swoon theory. Do you want to say more about that, John? Do you want to unmute?
Kaklase namin ito yung nagtatanong.
Hi, Dr.
Mag-ingay
Okay, can you hear me?
We can barely hear you. Do you want to type it in the chat box and we'll go to the next question for now?
Or just answer the swoon theory.
I doubt that Carrier would say swoon theory. Well, of course, he denies, he thinks Jesus never existed. So, I mean, that's really bizarre. So I guess the swoon theory or apparent death theory is even less bizarre. So maybe he does go with it. But if that's what they're talking about, I mean, I don't know of really any, I only know of one bona fide scholar in the relevant field who thinks that Jesus may have survived his crucifixion. Her name is Barbara Tearing. She's a member of the Jesus Seminar. And she's about the only scholar in the world that historian or New Testament scholar who thinks that Jesus may have survived his crucifixion. And nobody really follows her. I mean, she goes on to say that Jesus, he was in the tomb. They gave some herbs to heal him. He came out, he married Mary Magdalene, and they went off to either Germany or France and had children, something like that. I mean, it's just wacky, Da Vinci Code kind of stuff, you know? There's a number of reasons why we should reject the hypothesis that Jesus survived his crucifixion. Number one, Jesus's death by crucifixion is reported in a fair amount of independent sources. So not only do we have multiple independent Christian sources, some of which are quite early, like with Paul, and early oral tradition in Paul that goes back within just a few years of Jesus' supposed death. So you have early, you've got multiple independent sources, such as you got Paul, you've got Mark, you've got John, at least. Then you also have unsympathetic sources like Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Mara bar Serapion. Now, uber skeptics will say Josephus, the whole thing with Josephus was a Christian interpolation, but that's not what the majority of scholars say. The majority of scholars do think that the text in Josephus that mentions Jesus' death was doctored up subsequently, sometime in the 2nd or 3rd century by a Christian. But a few years, 20 years ago, actually, I asked the world's leading Josephus scholar at that point. He's now dead. His name was Louis Feldman. And I asked him, he had written a book, something like Josephus Scholarship from 1937 to 1985, something like that, okay? And but here it was, almost 15 years later, and I said, you're a Josephus expert. What would you say today is the percentage of Josephus specialists who think that Josephus actually mentions Jesus? And he said, well, it's at least 3-1. And I wouldn't be surprised. He said, I wouldn't be surprised if it were 5-1. So by far, the majority of Josephus scholars do think that Josephus mentions Jesus and mentions his death by Pontius Pilate.
Hey, Doc.
So, did someone say something?
Hey, Doc. Is there any evidence about Paul witnessing or being close to the crucifixion and resurrection?
No, we don't have any specific or direct evidence for that. Now, you do have a lot of, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but you'll do have some non-believers, some skeptics who will say, Paul never mentioned Jesus. He never saw, or Paul never met Jesus. He never saw or heard him in person. And that seems to be a bit of a stretch to me. We read the Gospels, and Jesus is going up to Jerusalem all the time for these different feasts, all these Passovers, the various feasts. And Paul was a Pharisee, very committed Jew, and so he's going to be there as well at all these feasts. Jesus creates this disturbance in the temple. Paul would have almost certainly heard about that. Who knows? He may have even been at Jesus's trial at some point or present when they delivered Jesus to Pilate. We don't know. He might have been there at Jesus's crucifixion. There was some reason why Paul hated Jesus. He hated the movement Jesus began and tried to destroy it. So he knew about Jesus' teachings, and I don't think we should be surprised at all if Paul had met Jesus or heard him speak. But that said, we can only look at possibility here. We have no direct evidence for or against it. So back to Jesus' death, you've got Christian sources, early, some eyewitness sources, or at least those rooted in eyewitness testimony, like with Mark and John. You've got unsympathetic sources. Like I said, multiple independent sources. You've got the fact that we only have one account in antiquity of a person surviving crucifixion, and that comes from Josephus, who reports having seen 3 of his friends crucified during the fall of Jerusalem. And he went to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, and asked that all 3 be, as a favor to him, that all 3 be their lives be spared, they be removed from their crosses. And Titus granted that favor to Josephus. He had all 3 removed from their crosses and provided the best medical care available. In spite of that, 2 of the 3 still died. So even if Jesus had been removed prematurely and medically assisted, his chances of survival were still quite small. But to complicate that, we don't have a scrap of evidence that suggests Jesus was removed while alive, or that he was provided any medical care whatsoever, much less the best Rome had to offer at that point. So whereas someone on the internet can posit whatever they want, historians have to choose the best explanation. They are confined to the evidence. They're confined to what's probable, not to what's merely possible. And so given all the evidence we have for Jesus' death by crucifixion, without any good evidence to the contrary, the historian at least has to conclude that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him. All right, I'm seeing from Megan and Mark, can we extrapolate anything? Oh, let me move back. Can we extrapolate anything from Christ's bodily resurrection as to what our bodies will be when he returns? That's a great question. Yes, we can. So it seems that the Apostle Paul thinks that when we die, our spirits leave our bodies and go to be with Christ in heaven. We've got this in 2 Corinthians 5:8, where Paul says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. I was reading something in 1 Corinthians 15 the other night too, and I forgot what it is, but it supports that same view. Also, in Philippians chapter 1, I think it's around verses 22 and 23. It's right after Paul says, for to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And the situation Paul's in, he's in imprisonment, he's facing possible execution. And he says, after he says, for to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. For me to live is Christ, it's serving Christ, it's knowing Christ, that's all life means to me. To die is gain. Why? Because he's going to get to be with Christ in person. And he says, I don't know which to choose. He says, I'm hard pressed from both directions, having the desire to die and be with Christ, for that is very much better, yet to remain in my body is more necessary for your sake. So Paul sees himself that if he dies, he goes to be with Christ immediately, right? You got Jesus saying to the thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise. So this is the view Paul has. But of course, we're not taking our bodies with us in heaven. My parents, my mom and dad died 6 and 7 years ago. If I were to go to their graves today and exhume the coffins, I would see their corpses. Their corpses had not been resurrected. But if Paul's correct, if Jesus is correct, their spirits are with Christ in heaven. Now here's where it gets pretty cool. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that, verse 20, Paul says, Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. In other words, he's to be first to be raised from the dead with a resurrection body. 3 verses later, he says, when we will be raised, he says, but each in his own order, Christ the first fruits, after that, those who belong to Christ at his coming. So he's talking about our resurrection is going to be when Jesus returns. But in the meantime, our spirits are with him in heaven. Now, let me give you one more text here. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. Paul says, I don't want you to grieve as those who have no hope. And he's talking to those who have lost loved ones. He says, because when Christ returns, he will bring with him those who have died in Christ. So he's bringing the spirits with him, spirits of believers with him, disembodied spirits. If you and I die before Christ returns, we will exist as disembodied spirits with Christ in heaven upon death. So, but he's going to bring us back with him. And then Paul adds, the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will be raised first. Well, wait a minute. How are the dead going to be raised when they're returning with Christ? Well, it's simple. He's bringing the spirits of believers back with him, who are then reunited with their corpses that are resurrected and transformed into that resurrection body. It is a bodily resurrection. It's the same kind of resurrection body that Jesus had when he was raised. So it's immortal, it's glorious, it's powerful, and it's animated by the Holy Spirit. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 42 through 44. So that's how it's been. We die, we become disembodied spirits in the presence of Christ in heaven. When he returns, he brings us back with him. Our spirits are reunited with our bodies that are then resurrected and transformed. So I hope that makes sense to you, Megan and Mark.
Okay, we got another question from Noah. I've had a number of people mention the other resurrections in Matthew 27 not having historical grounding. In essence, they argue that such an event would be recorded outside of Matthew and therefore isn't accurate. What would you say to someone who says that?
Yeah, fair question. I get asked that a lot. So Gary Habermas says he's asked that all the time as well. I have, and a number of New Testament scholars have a different kind of take on this. When I study the ancient literature, I'm talking about Jewish literature, Greco-Roman literature, the ancient literature, there is something that we don't really use today in our culture, but they're called portents. And like for example, Josephus reports that just before the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in the year 70, there were a number of portents. He reports that there was an eclipse of the sun. He reports that there was a comet. He reports that in the temple, a cow gave birth to a lamb. He reports that fighting was seen in the heavens. Remember some of these things like eclipse, a comet, fighting seen in the heavens. He also reports that the gates to the temple, which took more than 20 men to opened by themselves. Okay. So he reports these things. Now, it's pretty interesting that Cassius Dio reports that when Caesar went into Egypt, a number of portents also occurred. He says that there was an eclipse of the sun, there was a comet, that the gates to the temple of Jupiter or Zeus, which took many men to opened by themselves, that fighting was seen in the heavens, and that voices were heard in forests. When Julius Caesar died, when he was assassinated, you have a number of ancient authors report a number of portents, like an eclipse of the sun and a comet. In fact, we do know that Halley's Comet appeared that year. But Livy, who's writing in poetic language, when he's reporting in his History of Rome, when he's reporting about, no, I'm sorry, Virgil didn't write a History of Rome. I was thinking Livy there. When Virgil, who is writing poetry, mentions the assassination of Caesar, he not only mentions a comet, he says Mount Etna erupted, that streams stopped flowing, that black intestines were seen outside of cattle, that fighting was seen in the heavens, and that pale phantoms were seen walking around at sunset. So isn't it interesting that when we come to Matthew, we find darkness covers the earth, that there was an earthquake, the temple veil splits from top to bottom. I think Luke says from bottom up, but Mark and Matthew says top to bottom. And then it says the rocks split, the tombs were opened, and many of the saints, the dead saints, were raised, came out of their tombs after Jesus was raised and appeared to many, went into the holy city and appeared to many. So a couple things to think about here. Is Matthew giving us portents, just like we find Virgil and other Greco-Roman and Josephus doing? Is he doing the same thing? It's kind of like today we might say 9/11 was an earth-shaking event. Well, we're not really saying there was an earthquake on that day, right? We're using this as a figure of speech. So that's kind of what a portent was back then. So is Matthew doing this? It's kind of symbolic language. It's kind of special effects that are added in order to lay an emphasis that something of cosmic, even divine significance has occurred. This is where I'm leaning today. This is what I think happened. And here's why. Not only do we find such similarities in the Jewish as well as the Greco-Roman literature, we find it with Pentecost too, by the way, in Acts chapter 2. Not only do we find this in the Jewish literature and Greco-Roman literature, but then we got to ask, who were these raised saints? It's not all the saints, it's just some saints. Many saints were raised. Who were they? Were they raised in a resurrection body, or a body just like Lazarus, only to get sick and die again? Well, if it's raised in a resurrection body, then that contradicts Paul, because Paul says Christ is the first fruits of the general resurrection. These were raised at Jesus's death, but they came out of their tombs after his resurrection. So, and then what are they doing in the meantime between when they were raised and Sunday morning when they come out of their tombs? If you'd been there, would you see them pacing back and forth? Are they talking to one another? What's going on? if they are raised in a body, another mortal body, like the one in which they died, only to die again, well, now they haven't eaten or drank anything for 40 hours or more. So they're thirsty, they're hungry, they're homeless. They come out, they've got some really interesting stories to tell. They go into Jerusalem. Why is it that we don't hear about these folks anymore? We don't hear about any of their near-death experiences or what heaven's like or anything like that. They just kind of vanish. I think they're mentioned possibly by Ignatius, and then later on, centuries later, they're mentioned. And I think it's interesting that some of the early church fathers will mention the earthquake, they'll mention the temple veil splitting, but they don't mention the raised saints. So maybe this, I tend to think that it's a portent that Matthew added in there in order to emphasize an event of divine significance, that they had murdered the Son of God. So to say, well, there's no historical evidence that these, from other authors that these people were raised from the dead, would assume here that Matthew is talking about it in a historical sense. And for me, that would be almost equivalent to saying, well, what's the evidence that the prodigal son actually existed? You're asking the wrong question.
Gotcha. Yeah, we've got another one from Gavin. He asked that I lost the chat for a second, so I think we missed a few questions. If you guys feel like your question got passed over, just rewrite it if you could. But I've got one from Gavin that says, what do historians mean by bias?
Well, we're all biased, and historians are in virtual unanimous agreement that there is no such thing as an unbiased historian, one who's
your bias specifically towards your conception of historical bias.
All right, I'm sorry, say that again.
I'm saying, like, what's your conception of historical bias given your own historical bias?
Oh, well, we all have it. We all get into it, and we have an objective. When I got into my investigation of the resurrection of Jesus, I wanted to show that Jesus rose from the dead. And it was about 6 months into my investigation, as I'm reading philosophy of history and historical method, I came to realize that my own personal bias would severely threaten the integrity of my investigation. And I could see it, as I proceeded, I could even see my bias at work at times. So, for example, I might read a book or a journal article written by a skeptic trying to debunk the resurrection. And I might just be skimming through it or reading through it, just kind of quickly. Whereas if I'm reading a book or a journal article written by someone with whom I agree, I'll read it more carefully. And so I could see that going on, and I'd say, well, this isn't right. If I'm going to be an objective historian here, if I'm going to do this with integrity, I've got to give the skeptical writings just as every bit as I've got to give equal consideration to them, honest consideration, as I do the people with whom I agree. And so you have to make a concerted effort. Now, you never get to a point where you are entirely objective or neutral. Nobody does. Nobody gets there. But I do think that you can get close, and you may even get to the point where you're completely neutral. But then I found, and I think I did reach that point several times. And the reason I say several times is because I discovered that once you get there or get close to that point, you just can't move on, because you will, within a short period of time, go back to your default position. So not only do you have to make a very deliberate effort to approach it neutrally, then you also have to make a very deliberate and sustained effort to remain in an objective position. And so I came up with 6 steps that I applied throughout my investigation. They're not of my own invention. It's as I was reading other historians and philosophers of history, things that they did and suggested. Things such as acknowledge that you have a bias. A lot of scholars don't even do that. Skeptical New Testament scholars rarely ever acknowledge their bias. Christian New Testament scholars rarely ever acknowledge they have a bias. It's always the other person who has the bias, but we all have it. So that's one thing we have to do. Number two, you make your method, you come up with a specific method and make that method public so that people can assess the actual method that you are using to see if it makes sense and call you into question uh, uh, if it's bad method. A third thing is you make sure that you submit your findings to unsympathetic experts, because we all have blind spots and we don't know what they are because they're blind spots. But people who don't think as we do, experts who don't think as we do, don't have those same blind spots. Now, they've got their own, of course, but they don't have the same ones we have. And so to have their skeptical, critical eye look at what we are proposing, and to see what they have to say can be very valuable. It can cause us to jettison certain arguments or rework them because we know that there was weaknesses in them. So critical assessments are valuable. They provide some good things for us. We don't have to agree with them because their critical feedback might be mistaken, but we should look at it. So that's why you want to do that to scholars in the field. Submit it to unsympathetic experts in the field to see what they have to say on it. So those are some of the steps that I took to manage my own bias. So now when someone accuses me of a bias, I'm fine in saying, well, of course I had a bias. So do you. But here are the steps I took in order to manage my bias while my investigation proceeded. What steps did you take? And rarely, if ever, will that person be able to respond with anything because they have never done anything to manage their own bias, because they don't even recognize they have one.
Oh, you've got two more pieces of criteria because I think these are really interesting. But Matt did have a clarification. So can you just give us those last two, the 4, 5, and 6, I guess?
Yeah.
Great.
I'll have to look in my book because I can't remember them right off.
Oh, it's okay. I was going to write them down for everybody, but Matt wanted to clarify what he was asking. He was asking more like, what is a bias? Or I guess, what counts as a bias as opposed to whether or not historians have it? Because I guess his question was more like, what would be a bias?
Well, my bias would be, when I did my investigation of the resurrection of Jesus, I wanted it to come out that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, I was willing to give up my Christian faith if the evidence pointed in another direction. My wife can tell you that. Gary Habermas, my best friend, can tell you how I was feeling. William Lane Craig, I'd shared some stuff with him. He can tell you how I really wrestled with the stuff. My doctoral supervisor could tell you where I was during that time. I shared it with very, very little, extremely small group of people. So, that was my bias. That was something I wrestled with. I was willing to give up my faith that the evidence pointed away from Christianity, because I figured if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, hey, I might like being a Christian, but it's like holding on to stock once the company's going belly up. I might like the stock, I might like the company, but it'd be foolish to hold on to it because it's going to be worthless. And the thing that I started to really fear was that my biases would get in the way of discovering truth, and it would cost me eternity. So we don't have to fear truth. We have to fear missing out on truth and going down the wrong road and it costing us big time. So that's bias. A bias on the part of a non-believer, let's say a Muslim. They want Islam to be true. They don't want Christianity to be true. And that can get in the way with them given an objective consideration of Christianity. You could have certain skeptics have an extremely strong bias against Christianity. They don't want Christianity to be true. I debated Matt Dillahunty, I think it was 3 years ago. And but about a year and a half ago, he was asked on Facebook if you knew for a fact that Christianity is true, would you become a Christian? And he said no. Just like that, one word, no. So he can go out and try to argue as much as he wants that Christianity isn't true. But the fact is, even if it were, it wouldn't matter to him. And in the debate, I asked him, look, what if you saw me beheaded right before you, right before your very eyes? And then an hour later, you see me alive again, my head attached, scar. And I said, God brought me back from the dead to tell you Jesus rose from the dead and Christianity's true. And by the way, when I was in heaven, I met a friend of yours who died 5 years ago. And right before he died, the two of you had a conversation. It was the last conversation he ever had. And you left the room and he died 5 minutes later. And so no one else ever knew about this conversation. You never shared it with someone. And this person shared it with me because he's in heaven. And here's what you guys discussed. And you're just amazed because there's no possible way I would have known that. If that actually occurred, would you at least be willing to admit that there is a spiritual dimension of reality? And he said, I don't know, maybe not. So that just shows that a person's bias, they're usually led by their bias more than they are by the facts. And the problem with that is bad philosophy corrupts good history.
Well, as a philosopher, I can definitely sympathize. Okay, so Eric Scott wanted to ask, he said, it appears Mary does not immediately recognize Jesus with whom she was close. Cleopas and his companion on the road to Emmaus didn't recognize him, though he had been a virtual groupie. Can you address what about Jesus made him unrecognizable to those who had known him? What does that say, if anything, about his resurrected body?
Good question. So in terms of Cleopas and the second Emmaus disciple, whose name is anonymous, Luke says that their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Okay. So he kind of plays with them for a while when he says, why the long faces, guys? And they say, are you the only one in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's going on here? And he says, no, what? It must have been fun. But it says their eyes were kept from recognizing him. John is different. And, we can only take a guess here. So when she sees Jesus, she's inside the tomb and Jesus is outside the tomb. Now, I've been to Jerusalem twice. I've been at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and right around there. And that's where most scholars think that the actual tomb of Jesus is. And I've been inside a tomb that was like the tomb of Jesus. And it's really difficult. I mean, you've got to stoop down. I'm 6'3", so I had to scoop down and kind of crawl on my knees to get inside. Now, once you're inside, it opens up a little bit. Okay. But so she's inside. It's only at the most, a 4-foot entrance. So she's inside. It's morning. Jesus is speaking to her from outside the tomb. He's standing. There's a good chance she didn't see his head. So that's one thing. And then she probably has tears in her eyes at the same time, right? And then maybe she turns around. She might not have even seen him at that. I mean, she might have seen him standing there, but she might not have seen his head. Who knows? He might have been wearing a hoodie or something. We don't know. But as soon as he said Mary, then she recognized who it was. So there could be any number of reasons why she didn't recognize him at first. Plausible natural explanations.
What about the scarring? I've heard that it literally says in Isaiah that they tore his beard out, or it does not in Isaiah. It actually mentions in the text that his beard was torn out. It was marred beyond that of any man. I've heard people float the idea that maybe it was because he was beaten so badly that he was scarred. But then I've heard other people say that that's a terrible thing. His resurrected body wouldn't bear his same scars. And yet in Revelation, it says the lamb with the marks of slaughter was the one whom John saw. So I've always been kind of drawn to the idea that Jesus had that his face was very different after the beating he took. But I don't know. I don't know if that's relevant to this discussion.
No, I couldn't tell you. If someone pulled your beard out, would your face be permanently scarred or something? I don't know. I really don't know. He was probably really messed up when he was on the cross. In fact, Seneca, who wrote in the first century. He died around the same time Paul wrote, the same time Paul died, and Seneca the Younger was considered to be perhaps the greatest Roman mind of the first century, a lawyer and a philosopher. And Seneca said he described crucified victims as being maimed, misshapen, deformed, nailed, and drawing the breath of life amidst long drawn out agony. So when he says maimed, misshapen, and deformed, I mean, that's a pretty nasty description of what a person on the cross looked like. Now, I would suppose Jesus did have his some scars when in his resurrection body, because he invited Thomas to put his hands in the nail prints in his hands, and to put his hand into his side where the spear had gone. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'd been, I mean, most of us guys are like, whether we'd been in the military or not, and I was never in the military, but it's like if you go into war, you go into combat and you get shot and you have a scar. Let's say you get shot in the arm or you get shot in the chest, and then, you've got that bullet hole there. I mean, that's something you did for your country, and you could have that scar and wear it with pride. And it's like, man, Jesus died for us, and he's got the scars, the nail prints in his hands and his feet and in the side. I mean, those are pretty cool things. I mean, that's a cool scar. Those are cool scars there. And I'm not saying that in a joking manner. I mean, if you're a guy, you understand that,
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. I'm very sympathetic to that view, but I don't know how much historical weight it holds. But we won't. I'll talk about that with you another time. There's another question. Caesar Ballista Jr. said, "Are those disembodied spirits? Do they have consciousness? Because this seems to contradict Ecclesiastes 9:5." What do you think about that?
Well, I'd have to look up Ecclesiastes 9:5, but yeah, I would say they have consciousness, because Paul says that he would prefer to die and be with Christ, for that is very much better. So if he was in a soul sleep, he's not really with Christ. And if he's with Christ and in an unconscious state, better than the conscious state in which he's in now.
So Ecclesiastes 9:5. Do you want me to read it?
Sure.
The New International Version says, "For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no further reward, and even their name is forgotten." That's sort of like Sheol kind of.
Gotcha. Oh, okay. So the question here is about this contradiction between Ecclesiastes and the conscious state of believers. Yeah, I haven't. There have been a number of studies on the views of the afterlife, and a developing view within Judaism itself. I can only say that certain studies have been done. I've never engaged in that study, so I really can't comment, except to say, yeah, there is certainly a contradiction here in the way Solomon viewed what was happening after death, and how the New Testament writers view it after death, what happens after death, and Jesus.
Gotcha.
Today you'll be with me in paradise.
Okay. We have another question. Thanks for all your work, Dr. Licona. Greetings from Indonesia, though I'm quarantined at Biola.
Oh,
Two questions from me. What is one or two the most plausible alternative explanations you've heard against the resurrection of Jesus? And who are philosophers of history that you look up to the most?
oh, okay, cool. Well, hey, thanks for the greetings from Indonesia. As you know, I've been there twice and love going there. Love going there. We just have had a blast each time, and very fruitful ministry. So now I'm trying to remember what the question was. Repeat it, please.
I'll repeat it for you. He said, thanks for all your work. He's quarantined. He said, what is one or two of the most plausible alternative
Okay,
explanations?
and then the best All right, philosophers of history I really like. My favorite is Behan McCullough, and he's an Australian philosopher of history. And I just, I've had great correspondence with him. We disagree on whether historians are within their professional rights to investigate miracles, but he understands where I'm at. And we've had friendly discussions on it. I love the way he approaches things. It's very methodical, very specific, more than just about any other philosopher of history that I've read. I like Chris Lorenz. I like um, Richard Evans at Cambridge. Boy, there are several of them. And um, so you have to excuse my mind going blank a little bit. It's 11 o'clock here, and I'm used to being in bed by this time. And listen, I'm not complaining, but my mind's just not going to be as fresh since I've been up since early this morning. In terms of natural explanations that I think are difficult, I don't know. I think skeptics have presented any that I think are challenging. I really don't. I honestly don't. However,
What about some, like anomaly theory? Like Bart Ehrman pushes this in a debate I've seen. He just goes like, well, what would happen if, Jesus is, taken, he's killed and thrown in a mass grave. And then there's just a different set of events that are just completely humdrum, but people would have interpreted it as his resurrection due to his other claims and things like that. Is there anything like that inside of that stock of objections that would convince?
no, I mean, that's just ridiculous. Number one, Jesus was not just thrown into a common grave because they didn't have that in Jerusalem. That was throughout the rest of the Roman Empire, but it wasn't in Jerusalem that way. And in fact, Josephus is fairly clear here. And Ehrman says he's not. He goes with a different explanation, but it's not a plausible one based on other data. So Josephus says that right before the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70, that Rome sent some mercenaries in and they killed a bunch of Jews, and they did not allow those Jews to be buried, to receive a proper burial. And so it says the Jews in Jerusalem got very upset because up until that point, it was their custom to remove the crucified and to give them a proper burial prior to sunset. So we know that prior to, probably no later than the year, or no earlier than the year 67, that the Romans allowed the Jews to receive a proper burial, even the crucified victims. And archaeological evidence bears that out. In 1967, there was an ossuary, that's a stone bone box, that what happened was Jews would be put in, when they died, they'd be put into a tomb for, say, a year for their body to decompose, and then they'd collect the bones and put them in an ossuary, and then they'd give that some sort of a proper burial. So this was the practice in Jerusalem from about 30 BC through the year 70 AD. And we've got remains of crucified victims, the skeletal remains of crucified victims, and victims of other sorts of execution, like burning alive. We found those in these ossuaries, which tells us that Jews who had been executed, like crucifixion, were given proper burials before the year 70. So we have it from Josephus, and we have it from archaeological evidence that this is the case. So there was no common grave in which people in Jerusalem were thrown in. And the reason being is because when the Romans conquered a people, they usually allowed them, in order to maintain peace, they usually allowed them to maintain a lot of their customs. I could give you other examples. Coinage would be one. And anyway, so that you've got that right there that would suggest that Ehrman is just wrong in that sense. Second, it wouldn't account for the conversion of Paul, because something like a stolen body or mistaken identity, any of those things that you want to suggest, Paul would certainly prefer that over resurrection. Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. We also wouldn't expect the conversion of James, the brother of Jesus. He didn't believe in him up to the time of his crucifixion. Why would he now convert to being his follower afterward if he knew that his brother was a false prophet and a failed Messiah and was remaining dead? Hallucinations might account for one or two at most of Jesus' disciples, because multiple studies in the world of mental health professionals have shown that approximately only 7% of those grieving the loss of a loved one experience a visual hallucination of that loved one. And yet we're saying all 100% of the Jesus disciples had a hallucination, and they had them in group settings, which that doesn't occur. So you've got the problem with the group hallucinations. You got the problem with 100% of them would have to experience a hallucination, when that goes way beyond the 7% average. And then you got to explain Paul. So you got all these problems with Ehrman's hypothesis. It just is a lousy hypothesis, historically speaking. So I don't really see any good natural explanations that have been offered out there. That said, if I were going to offer one, and I try to be as objective with this as possible, I would say this. I try to look at my own bias and say, you know what? I don't like Islam. I don't like the way it operates. It just isn't attractive to me in the least. But you know, if Islam is true, I would want to be a Muslim. Why? Because I fear God, and I'd rather worship a God I don't like than to be condemned by him to hell for eternity. So, but I don't like Islam. So the question I've asked myself, and I really don't know the answer to it, to be honest with you. Now, I haven't sat and really thought through, to be honest, too. But I don't know the answer to this. And the question is this. Let's say we don't have good evidence. Try to imagine we don't have good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And try to imagine that Islam has evidence favoring it that is as good as what we presently have for the resurrection of Jesus. So we don't have that evidence, but they do, to the strength that we have for the resurrection. Would I give up Christianity and become a Muslim? And I don't know the answer to that. It's good enough evidence, I think, to suggest Jesus rose from the dead. But would it be enough to push me to become a Muslim? And I don't know the answer. And to me, that is the only thing out there. It's subjective, and we're all different in this. But to me, that would, if I were going to go skeptic, that'd be the one I think I'd say. Or I'd say we just don't know enough, something like that.
That's usually the line of argument I hear, that we just don't know enough sort of thing. Noah wanted to ask you, though, he wanted to ask you about Matthew versus Markian priority. Are you familiar with the arguments for David Allen Black's view on Matthew's priority?
Yes, I have his book. I've read his book. I was not at all convinced by it. The evidence, I think, is overwhelming that Mark wrote first, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as their primary source and supplemented it. We see things such as Mark has awkward grammar that Matthew and Luke tend to smooth and improve. We see I can unpack any of this if you want, but we see editorial fatigue in Luke based on what we're reading in Matthew and Mark, a few occasions in Luke of that editorial fatigue. We see there's a general order that goes. Now, of course, birth is going to come before death, right? Baptism is going to come before the beginning of Jesus's ministry. Crucifixion comes before resurrection. So you do have a very general chronology that is required. But other than that, there are a number of things that aren't required, and yet they're following this chronology. Well, that's no big deal, because you'd say, well, it could happen that way. Yeah, it could. But here's the thing. Sometimes Matthew's chronology differs from that of Mark's. So in that case, when Matthew's chronology differs from Mark's, Luke and Mark's chronology usually remains the same. And there are occasions when Luke's chronology differs from Mark's, but when it does, Matthew and Mark's chronology remains the same. So it's as though Mark is what they call the middle term here. And so that suggests that Matthew and Luke are following Mark. So these are just a couple of the arguments that lead scholars to say Mark is first and Matthew used Mark as a source. You say, okay, well, what about the fact that some church fathers, especially Papias, who is our earliest, says that Matthew wrote first? Okay. Well, that can't just be simply dismissed. But here's what Papias wrote. Papias didn't say that Matthew wrote the first gospel. Papias says that Matthew first wrote the ta logia, the sayings, the teachings of Jesus. I think this could be referring to what scholars call Q. Q, the Q material, what they do is, assuming Markan priority, they say, okay, when Matthew, Mark, and Luke are reporting the same story virtually verbatim, then Mark is the source, and Matthew and Luke are using Mark. If Matthew and Luke if Matthew and Mark say the same thing, then the source is Mark. If Mark and Luke are using the same thing, saying the same thing, then Mark is the source. But there are about 220 verses in Matthew and Luke that are similar, some almost verbatim, some verbatim, very similar, that are in Matthew and Luke, but are absent from Mark. So they couldn't be using Mark in this way. So you say, well, what's going on? Well, it's only three options. Number one, Luke is using Matthew. Number two, Matthew is using Luke. Or number three, Matthew and Luke are using a common source, which we no longer have. And for a number of reasons, a majority of scholars today go with that third option. Now, it's just so happens that all of this so-called Q material, then that common source they call Q. And the reason they call it Q, by the way, is because the guy that came up with this in the 18th century, Gottlieb Stewart, it doesn't matter. He was German. And he said, what do we call this? Source. And the word for source in German is Quelle. So you just abbreviate that with Q. That's what Q is. It's just material that's common to Matthew and Luke that most scholars think they both got because they were using a common source. Now, here's the thing, and this is important. Those about 220 some verses, that's the Q material, virtually all of it is not narrative. It's just sayings or teachings. So when Matthew says that, or Papias says that Matthew first wrote the ta logia, the sayings, the teachings in the Hebrew dialect, he could very well be referring to the Q material, and that later on, after Mark wrote his gospel, Matthew got a scribe and said, I want you to take Mark, use that as the primary source, and under Matthew's supervision, Matthew also provided this Q material and some other eyewitness testimony that he had, and that's the Matthew that we have today. So we've got a plausible explanation for why the early church reported Matthew was the first, but we have still very good reasons for thinking that Mark wrote first and that Matthew used Mark as a source.
Okay, so Mike wants to know, how would you explain to someone the difference between Lazarus's rising from the dead and resurrection? I know there's a difference between resuscitation and resurrection, but Lazarus was in the tomb for 4 days. So how is resuscitation a valid explanation for this?
Well, the Greek word doesn't distinguish between resurrection and resuscitation. It's all a matter of context. you have two words in Greek that are used for resurrection. One is agero, which means to rise up like you're awakening out of sleep. And the other is anastasis, and that means to stand up again, to rise up again. It's like you're standing up, anastasis. And so Jairus' daughter, anastasis. You've got agero and anastasis that is used to things like Lazarus, Jairus' daughter, the widow's son. What distinguishes it is the context. There's no suggestion in the gospel accounts of when Jesus raised Lazarus, Jairus' daughter, or the widow's son, that they were raised with an immortal body, never to die again. The expectation is they were raised and restored to their prior state, their prior mortal state, but in a healthy state at this point. But that they would die again. They could experience sickness and die again. With Jesus, he's raised in an immortal body that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 42 through 44. And then you've got in the Gospels, he seems to possess, certain qualities to his body that we certainly don't have, where he can appear and disappear at will. He can keep someone from recognizing him. So there is it's distinguished by context, not by the language.
Gotcha. Okay, Xerxes asks, Bart Ehrman in his book, How Jesus Became God, argues, in history, history is not the past. He contends that historians can't presuppose the belief in God because God cannot be observed. In addition, he said that historians do not have access to the supernatural activities of God. Only theologians have that kind of access. He adds, theologians are certainly affirming that God caused miracles on theological grounds, not historical grounds. How do you respond to such claims?
That's easy. That's easy. Now, Bart and I have become friends over the years, but because, we've had interactions, I've spent a lot of time thinking through his stuff and reading his material. And I think this is just easy to answer. So let me just give another parallel illustration. So let's say that for about a decade, astronomers have been tracking a comet. And within the last year, they recognize that it's on a collision course with our moon. And they are able to determine that on a specific day and at a specific time on that day, the comet is going to slam into the moon's surface. And so on that day, the Hubble Space Telescope and a number of planetariums around the world are all zoomed in on the moon's surface, and we're watching on television. And we see the comet approaching the moon, and then we see it slam into the moon's surface. And as the dust settles, we notice that there is a message written on the lunar surface. And it's written in both Hebrew and in Greek, and it says, Jesus is Lord. Now, this is indisputable. And so everybody's just talking about this. And what does this mean? How did this message get on the moon? How did this ever occur? Well, astronomers, we could say, they have no access to God. And to say that God did this would be a theological explanation, not a scientific one, right? So I guess the comet didn't slam into the moon's surface. You see how ridiculous that is? But that's the same kind of thing that Ehrman is saying when it comes to the resurrection. No, what happens is a scientist, an astronomer would say the comet slammed into the moon and it caused a message to be written on the moon's surface in Hebrew and in Greek that says Jesus is Lord. But we, as a scientist, we do not have the tools to be able to determine how that message actually appeared. The historian can do the same thing. The historian can look at the data and say that Jesus rose from the dead, and we have no idea, given the tools that we have as historians, we cannot say that God did it. We will just say the event occurred and leave the cause undetermined.
Now, real quick, just to kind of, for my own curiosity's sake, I'm curious about this this quote. History is not the past. Like, what sort of mindset do you think goes into a claim like that? Because that's kind of odd. That just seems like it's either just completely vapid, or he's assuming some sort of postmodern something. Why would he say something like that in your view?
Well, I think I found about 23 different definitions for history when I was doing my research. Some of them weren't mutually exclusive, but there are different definitions of history. When we say we are studying history, what are we actually studying? Well, someone could, you can go and you can say, well, the event itself has already occurred, and we can't get into a time machine and go back and observe it again. So it's like Richard Evans at Cambridge talks about how when we look at reports about the past, it's like we're looking at the ashes and the embers that are left over from a fire, and we can stir them so that they kind of come to life again, and we can reconstruct the past. Another illustration that's given is it's like doing historical investigation is like we are looking through a window into the past, and the window is often very cloudy so that we can't see clearly into the past, but we can see some things that are moving on the other side of that window and make out some basic things of what is going on. And some things we've got enough evidence that we can see with a great deal of clarity. So when we're looking at the past and doing our history, our historical practice, what are we actually doing? Are we reconstructing the past as it actually happened? Well, not exactly, because what we have here are historians reporting. Historians themselves are biased. They have their own agenda, and we're seeing things through their lenses, not ours. And if they're using other sources, they're seeing those sources through their lenses. So there are two sets of lenses, and then we're looking at it through our lenses. So we're not really seeing history with complete clarity. What we are seeing is an interpretation of the past. Now, postmodernism would basically focus on that and say, well, all we have are interpretations. We can never get to the past. And so every reconstruction of the past is just historical fiction to an extent. That's where postmodernism goes with it. But a realist historian like myself, and most practicing historians are realist historians, would say, no, our reconstructions of the past are going to be fairly accurate. They're not going to be exhaustive. They're not going to be necessarily 100% accurate, but they're going to be, as Christopher Pelling would say, true enough.
Yeah, Xerxes followed up. He just wanted to say that, or he wanted to quote Ehrman directly. He said, the past is everything that happened before now. History is what we can establish as having happened before now. Miracles may be in the past, but they cannot be established as having happened. Big difference.
Yeah. Well, I do think we can establish miracles. I mean, it's like, again, what if, and this goes to the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence too. Let's go back to my debate with Matt Dillahunty, because I said this during the debate. Some Muslims come in, they say, Licona, you've debated Muslims, you've said Islam is a false religion, you've got to die. And they behead me right there on stage. And there it is, 1,000 people who see me beheaded, 1,000 eyewitnesses. And then an hour later, those 1,000 eyewitnesses see me alive again, giving that testimony that I was in heaven and had that conversation with Matt's friend. Now, is that a miracle? Do we have enough evidence for a miracle? Dillahunty says no. Ehrman himself would say no. I'd say that's crazy. Of course, we've got enough evidence for a miracle, that a miracle has occurred. Not only is that impossible by natural causes, but it also occurs in a context that's charged with religious significance. In other words, a context in which we would expect a God to act. So, but then I'd just say to Ehrman, all right, if you want to say miracles, historian can't say a miracle occurred, then I'd bring up my comet illustration and say, all right, well, the comet slammed into the moon's surface. It left the message, Jesus is Lord in Hebrew and in Greek. We have no natural explanation for it. We can still say the event occurred. So Bart, we got sufficient evidence to establish Jesus rose from the dead. The same Jesus who claimed and believed he had a unique relationship with God who had chosen him to usher in his kingdom. The same Jesus whom virtually every historian of Jesus would say that he performed deeds that astonished crowds and that he believed were divine miracles and exorcisms. This same Jesus, shortly after his death, he rose from the dead. That's where the evidence points us. Now, I can't prove as a historian that God did it, but he rose from the dead.
That's great. This is a good question. Megan and Mark Anderson popped up again, and they said, or they asked, how have you managed your bias through the investigation? How has remaining neutral how has this affected your faith? That's an interesting question. Yeah, how has being neutral or trying to take that neutral road, how has that affected your personal faith?
Yeah, well, while I was doing my investigation, my faith floundered, to be honest. My relationship with God grew cold. And we all have our idiosyncrasies, and one of mine is that I second guess everything. Everything from, did I buy the right watch? Did I buy the right car? Did I marry the right woman? And I mean, even though, my wife hates to, and she knows all this stuff, my wife hates to go shopping with me for that kind of thing. It depends what I'm going shopping for. But if I'm going shopping for clothes or something, she hates it because I just, boom, boom, everything. I'm just second guessing and all this. It's just stupid stuff, And so, of course, I'm going to do this with my worldview. And it just plagued me. I had been plagued up to that point as a second guesser about my Christian faith. And I really wanted this investigation of the resurrection to help me through my doubts. And so I told God as I went into it, I said, look, I'm really wanting this to help me with my doubts. But in order to do that, I have to come at it as objectively as possible. So I'd still go out and pray because I was convinced of God's existence, still convinced Christianity was true. But my prayers became like, God, I think the evidence is really compelling that you exist. I'm convinced by it, the scientific and philosophical evidence. If Christianity is not true, please show me. I am completely open to receiving it at this point. And as I debate atheists and Muslims on the resurrection, I'm trying to present my best arguments and let them present their best arguments. And even if you have to humiliate me, if that's what it takes to push me away from Christianity and push me to the truth, do it, because I want to know truth. Those were my prayers during that time. And I was seriously open-minded and objective to whether Christianity, whether Jesus rose from the dead. I wanted the evidence. So anyway, so my faith kind of floundered at that point, and but it became a lot stronger afterward. So I'm not suggesting that everybody do this kind of investigation. This is what you got to do as a historian, though, when you're looking at these kinds of things. Now that I've got that settled, when I come to other things, like my most recent project or more recent project was gospel differences. And it's like when I started seeing different things, we can talk about gospel differences another time if you want. But when I started seeing things, some things made me uncomfortable. And some of the conclusions I came to made me uncomfortable at first, but I had to go with where I believe the evidence was pushing. But knowing Jesus had risen from the dead and having that settled, it's like, you know what? If it turns out that there are some errors or contradictions in the Gospels, Christianity's still true. This is not a deal breaker. I can be completely open-minded to where the evidence leads. I don't want to put God in a box to say, well, this is the way he had to do things. So I was more open to things at that point, and I ended up coming to some conclusions that made me uncomfortable at first. So I still deal with bias, but now that I've got the resurrection settled, and I know I did that investigation with integrity, I can still come at things in a sense, even with less tensions about a bias, that it's got to be this way. I already know Christianity's true. So if there's some things that I've got to change about some other things that I believed in the meantime, I'm willing to do that.
I had a question about Mark and priority. If Mark and priority is usually it's the most widely held view, does it affect the view of the resurrection that the best manuscripts or the most accurate manuscripts have a shorter ending? Does that kind of throw shade on the way that we interpret the resurrection? How do you kind of absorb that sort of data when you come into those manuscript differentiations?
Yeah, I don't think it provides a problem at all. I mean, if it did, I'd say, I mean, there's some things in the Old Testament I've got problems with. It's like, I don't know how to explain them. And I'm happy to, I'm willing to say that. I'm willing to say there's some teachings of Jesus that bother me. I'm not saying he didn't teach them. I think he did. But when he says, hey, if you want to be my disciple, you got to take up your cross and follow me. It's like, I don't want to do that. I would think if God really loves me, he doesn't want me to die in a brutal, nasty sense. If he loves me, just let me deny him. He still knows I believe him, right? I would want my kids to deny me if it meant saving their lives. Why wouldn't God do that with me? I want to be the center of his universe, but he says, no, I need to be the center of your universe, Mike. And you do things to honor me. That's what I'm interested in. So there's some teachings about Jesus that kind of bother me, but I don't get to change things. So with that said, like I said, it's kind of late. I forgot what the question was now.
I was kind of like just seeing what you thought about.
Oh, the resurrection thing in Mark. Okay, so so I don't mind saying I think there's a problem, but I don't think there's a problem here, and here's why. First of all, Paul writes before Mark, and he mentions resurrection and appearances. So if Mark doesn't mention the appearances, well, Paul mentioned them beforehand. Second, Mark does know about appearances. Now, we don't know why his gospel ends that way. A lot of scholars think that he intended it to end there, but there's no agreement on why. It's like you got a room. You've heard, if you got a room with 3 rabbis, there's 5 different opinions. Well, there are tons of different reasons that New Testament scholars give for why Mark would have ended his gospel at chapter 16, verse 8. But nobody's in agreement. There's no majority position at all. There's like a gazillion different possibilities that have been posited. The other option would be that Mark either did not complete his gospel for one reason or another, or that the ending was lost. I don't know what, but I go with that second option. Mark did not intend for verse 8 of chapter 16 to be the end of his gospel. Mark does seem to know about appearances because Jesus predicts his death and his resurrection on numerous occasions in Mark. Like, for example, you've got it in chapter 8, verses 31 through 30 and following, where Jesus predicts his death and resurrection, and Peter rebukes him and says it can't be this way, and Jesus rebukes Peter and calls him Satan. In the next chapter 9, around verse 30, Jesus predicts his death and resurrection again. You got him predicting it at the Last Supper. So multiple times throughout Mark, he predicts his death and resurrection. And then in chapter 14, verse 28 of Mark, he says that after he has risen from the dead, he will go ahead of them to Galilee, and there they will see him. And then the angel says to the women in chapter 16, verse 7, remember how he told you that after he'd been risen, now go and tell Peter and the rest of the disciples that he has gone ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you. So we are certainly to expect that the disciples went up to Galilee and saw Jesus just as he had predicted. Now, a skeptic could say, yeah, but the Mark says in verse 8 that they ran from there, and out of fear and trembling, they said nothing to no one. And that's how the gospel ends. Say, well, if they said nothing to no one, how does Mark know about it? Besides, in chapter 1 of Mark, verse 44, Jesus heals a leper and tells him to go and say nothing to no one, but to show himself to the priest how God has healed him. So what Jesus is saying there, it's the same grammatical construction. He's saying, don't stop along the way and tell anyone about it, but go directly to the priest and tell him what happened. What Mark is saying there, using the same grammatical construction, he's saying the women fled from the tomb and said nothing to no one along the way. They went directly to Peter and the disciples to tell him. And then it ends there. So it's a bizarre ending. I don't think it's meant to be the ending, but even if it is, Mark knows about the appearance in Galilee at minimum.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. That's helpful for me, especially. Kathleen wanted to know, could you give some reasons, and you did expound on this a little bit, but can you maybe expound on it a little bit more, the reasons to support the existence of Q?
Yeah. So this would be material that appears in both Matthew and in Luke, and in all but two, I think just two times, it's just teachings. It has nothing to do with any kind of narrative at all. And if there's a narrative in the only 2 or 3 occasions, it's very brief. So these are mainly, it's like 220 some verses. That's the Q material. And it's just sayings or teachings of Jesus, no narrative involved. And a lot of times it's verbatim. So, like, for example, ask and it will be given, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks it will be open. It's like 30 some words in Greek verbatim. You've got Jesus on one occasion, he's talking about the Queen of the South came. The Queen of the South came to Solomon, but something greater than Solomon is here. The men of Nineveh repented at the preaching of Jonah, but something greater than Jonah is here. So you've got this in Matthew and in Luke, and it's verbatim, except for just like 2 different words. Except that in one of them they have inverted. So like in one of them it's men of Nineveh and then Queen of the South, and the other it's inverted. And other than that, there's only like 2 different words different in that whole 60 some words. So you've got this stuff that's verbatim, and you've got so many different stories that are so similar that appear in Matthew and in Luke, the same stories. And the verbal similarities are striking. And so, either Luke is using Matthew, Matthew is using Luke, or they're using a common source. Now you say, well, wait a minute. If they're reporting the same event, why wouldn't they be using a lot of the same words? Okay, well, we don't see this elsewhere when it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When it seems that Matthew and Luke are using Mark, it's not always that all 3 of them are using such verbal similarities. But here's another thing. So why is it that that's happening with these teachings? So then you look and you say, consider this following scenario. Let's say that all of us who are in this chat right now, that we get together. Let's say I come out there and you guys have a get together at Biola. And so we all get together, and afterward we go out to dinner. And so we're at this big table and we're all just cutting up and having some fun. But we notice there is a little altercation, verbal altercation that's going on at a table next to us between a guy and a woman. And it's getting heated. And after about 5 minutes of this conversation, they're standing up, they're yelling at each other, and the woman picks up a wine bottle and crashes it over the guy's cheek, and it splits his cheek open. He's got this big gash. Well, just at that point, the police arrive. They arrest the woman. Paramedics come. They attend to the guy's wound. And a police officer comes over to our table and says, "Did you all witness that?" "Yep." "Did you hear the discussion?" "Yep." "Did you hear what they were saying?" "Yep." "All right. I want you all to write down on a piece of paper for me what they said and what happened as accurately as possible." Now, of course, we would, not remember precise wording. We might remember a few of the precise words, but things said over a 5-minute period, we're not going to remember everything, and we're not going to remember most of it verbatim. We're going to give the gist of what we remembered, okay? Now, there's one more item. They were speaking in Spanish. But it just so happens that all of us are fluent in Spanish, okay? So the police officer is not. So the police officer says, not only do I want you to recall the words as accurately as possible and order of events, but I want you to translate it from Spanish to English because the cop doesn't know Spanish. So we do that. Now, anyone here who's even familiar just a little bit with another language understands that when you translate, you don't get a word for word correspondence because the grammar is different. And how you translate a paragraph today will probably be a little bit different than how you translate it tomorrow. So now with all this in mind, remember, we're trying to recall this just 20 minutes after it happened. 20 minutes after this altercation happened, we're trying to recall and report down these events and do it as accurately word for word as possible. And even if the conversation was in English, there's no way that even after just 20 minutes, our reports are going to line up virtually word for word. The fact that we're translating it from Spanish to English just complicates it all the more. So let's suppose then we hand in our documents, the police officer checks it and finds that it's virtually verbatim, all of ours. Well, that officer would know that some collusion took place. And so that's how scholars look and they say, wow, these 220 verses, many of it verbatim, the verbal similarities are striking. And they're recalling it not 20 minutes later, but probably 30 to 40 years later. And they are recalling most of what was uttered in Aramaic, they're recalling it in Greek. So when you see the verbal similarities, you can recognize that there is some sort of a literary relationship here. Someone is using something else as a source. Either Luke is using Matthew, Matthew is using Luke, or both are using a common source.
Now, she wanted to follow up. Is there any way that in a culture that's so versed in oral tradition, like the culture we're talking about, is there any way that this could be described by just word of mouth, like passing it on orally?
Sure. So if that's the case, though, Q is still would still be oral tradition. All right. And we don't have this kind of similarities with the rest of the stuff when Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the triple tradition, is done. So it would seem that the gospel authors were a lot more, gave a lot more fidelity to reporting things with precision when it's the words of Jesus involved than if they're just trying to recall the details of events that had occurred. They're not so concerned about precision there. They're more concerned with the sayings of Jesus. And one further thing about the literary relationship. It's interesting to note that in Jesus's Olivet Discourse. So Palm Sunday has taken place. It's the week in which Jesus is going to be crucified. It's either Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday that this is happening. And they have left Jerusalem, and Jesus, when they were passing by the temple, they admired, they said, Jesus, these buildings are amazing. And Jesus tells them not a stone will be left one on the other. And when they get back to the Mount of Olives, they say, well, when will these things happen? And Jesus starts to tell them about when these things will happen. And there will be famines, and there will be earthquakes, and there will be wars and rumors and wars. And when the Roman armies surround Jerusalem, let the reader understand, then you should flee to the mountains. Now that's pretty interesting when you see this. When the Roman soldiers surround Jerusalem, bracket here, let the reader understand, then you should flee to the mountains. So this is a little note that was inserted, that Mark inserted there for the person who's going to read it, maybe to provide some comment. It's interesting that when you read the same story in Matthew, he talks about when the armies surround Jerusalem, let the reader understand. There is a literary relationship here. It's not oral tradition in this. We can see that Matthew is using Mark here. Either that or Mark is using Matthew as a source. And again, there are reasons for thinking it's the other way. Matthew used Mark. But there is a literary relationship here between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And trying to figure out what that relationship is what scholars call the problem, or you could call it the synoptic puzzle, because it's not really a problem. It's just a problem trying to figure out what's going on.
Now, Caesar's going off a little bit in the chat. I've been trying to track what he's saying. He's still going on about how the resurrection body, like the resurrection and Jesus' resurrected body, and the information we have about death in the afterlife, given the Old and New Testament. Some of the stuff he's saying is a little specific. I kind of wanted to get his attention and have him maybe ask you instead of me moderating it to you, because I might butcher it. Caesar, if you can hear me, do you want to maybe unmute your mic and ask? Because some of these things seem pretty specific. Hmm. All quiet on the Western Front.
So I'm seeing one here. Are those disembodied spirits have consciousness? Oh, that right. So we already looked at that one.
Yeah.
So let me scroll down here. I guess it's quite a way. Okay. His physical appearance was already been changed because Jesus was an example. By the way, when someone speaks or writes in broken English, one thing you can know is they know one more language than I do. That he was also changed. Okay, so let's see. In John 20, verse 17, Jesus didn't go to heaven when he was resurrected. The punctuation mark in the Bible was added, and the comma should be put in front of today, and the meaning would be different. Well, you're right. In Greek, there is no punctuation marks. In fact, in ancient Greek, there wasn't even any spaces between words or sentences or paragraphs. Everything was one letter after another run on. So let's see, John 20, verse 17. Let me look that up in Greek. And
it's a shame my roommate just walked away. He knows Greek. I could have gotten him on the line.
That's all right. I got it here. 20, verse 17. All right. Jesus says to her, do not touch me, for not yet I have ascended to the Father. Okay, so what are you saying? Didn't go to heaven when he was resurrected. The punctuation mark in the Bible was added. Comma should be put in front of today.
Maybe is he suggesting that Jesus,
I don't see the word today in the Greek.
Is he suggesting that Lazarus didn't go to heaven, but Jesus did? and he's describing something different about Jesus rather than Lazarus in their different resurrections.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Lazarus went to heaven when he died. Why Lazarus did not give any testimonies what heaven like? Well, we don't know if he didn't. They're not recorded if he did. His experience to die and to be resurrected will be one of the most important evidence of going to heaven when we die. It's clear. He doesn't know anything when he dies. I think that's jumping to conclusions, Cesar, because just because that's an argument from silence. It doesn't say about what his experience was like, but it doesn't say that he wasn't relating about his experience. I think you're just making a conclusion from silence there.
Yeah, and the whole clause about today you'll be with me in paradise.
Oh, maybe that's what he meant. Today you will be with.
Because he says
That's
that to
not
the thief.
John 20:17.
Yeah, he says that. He says today you'll be with me in paradise to the thief, and yet you don't hear anything about Lazarus being in heaven, and then that kind of correlates back to the Ecclesiastes bits.
Okay, so the today you'll be with me in paradise, that's in Luke.
I think he's trying maybe saying like, forgive me, like, this is the argument, like saying like today I tell you you will be with me in paradise, which would be different than saying today you will be with me in paradise. I wonder if he's trying to make that claim with a comma. I don't know.
Oh, okay. All right, let's see. It's Luke 23:43. And he said to him, truly I say to you, today with me you will be in paradise. Okay. Truly I say to you today, with me you will be in paradise. Okay. So grammatically that's possible. But then you got to, I mean, why would Jesus connect the today to truly I say to you? Well, I mean, it's so obvious it's today. He's not saying, I say to you tomorrow, you will be with me. I say to you yesterday. Now, it could have been, I said past tense to you yesterday, but that's not what it says. It's present tense. I am saying, truly to you, I am saying. So, truly, I'm saying to you today, you will be with me in paradise. I think it makes more sense. Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. That makes more sense to me than if you connected the today to truly I say to you, truly I say to you today. That's just redundant. It's banal. It's there'd be no reason for putting the today there. They're talking right there. Now it could be truly I say to you now, or truly I say to you at this minute. But I mean, again, that just wouldn't make that doesn't make much sense that he would say something like that. That doesn't seem plausible to me.
It depends on, I guess, what we're all trying to get at with that. Like, what does it do if depending on which fork in the road you take, what sort of conclusion does that lead you to about what we mean by paradise and what we mean by resurrection? But that's kind of unclear by his questions.
Over with that one.
All right. Okay. If it's more likely the evidence of testimony in support of miracles is false, then we should not believe in them.
No, I agree.
This principle of evidence is based on the intuition that it requires more evidence to establish a miracle than it does to an ordinary event.
No, I don't agree with that.
Okay.
And here's why. Let's go back with the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We're at a debate. I'm debating someone, and some Muslims come in and they behead me in front of everyone on stage. And then an hour later, I walk out while everybody's talking to the police, and I'm alive again. You witnessed it. Was that extraordinary? I mean, it was an extraordinary event, of course, but is the evidence extraordinary? No, it's no more extraordinary than if you watched it at a baseball game. You were an eyewitness, whether you saw an eyewitness at a baseball game or you saw me being decapitated and later saw me alive. It's an extraordinary event, but the evidence isn't extraordinary by any means. Extraordinary claims do not require extraordinary evidence.
Understood. Okay, this will be the last one then because you've only got like 2 minutes left. I just wanted to get this one guy on here. William Gee asks, what evidence for the resurrection do you think is the weakest, and how do you respond when people ask about it?
The weakest evidence for the resurrection. Um, well, there's evidence. I think the evidence. Okay, so here's how I approach it. I look at what historians would call historical bedrock. Okay, Gary Habermas calls it minimal facts. So these would be facts that are so strongly supported by the data that virtually all scholars who study the subject grant them. Okay, even skeptics. So there are some things for which the evidence is really good. Again, like the evidence that the tomb was empty, very good evidence for it. But it's not granted by nearly all scholars who study the subject. And so it's not included as historical bedrock or as one of Gary's minimal facts. So that's not as strong as, say, the appearances to the disciples. The appearance to James is, as far as my research went, I think I recall reading 29 scholars who opined on it, and about, I think, all but 3, John Painter, Richard Bauckham, and oh, what's his name? He teaches at UNC Charlotte. He had that bizarre view years ago that of the Talpiot tomb that had belonged to Jesus. He was the only scholar who ever believed that. James Tabor. Those are the only 3 scholars that I knew of who would say that James was a believer during Jesus's lifetime. But I remember having a discussion with Bauckham on this, and I said, well, here's why I think you're wrong on this. And we had just had a pleasant discussion, and I said, I want to know what you think. And he said, well, John Painter is the one who convinced me years ago that Jesus was, or James was a believer. His brothers were believers during his ministry. And he interpreted John chapter 7 in such a way. And I said, well, here's why I think that interpretation doesn't work. What do you think? And he said, I don't have any answers to that. I'd have to really think about it. And I've never discussed it with him since. But here's the thing, out of 29 scholars that I found who opined on it, only those 3 were the only ones who said James was not a believer before, and that he became a believer because Jesus rose. He believed Jesus rose and appeared to him. So we could go with a heterogeneous consensus of the scholars who opine on it. The problem is, rather than hundreds of scholars, I only found 29 who opined on it. So I didn't think it was quite as good evidence as some of the other things, like Jesus died by crucifixion, that, the appearance to Paul, the appearance to the disciples, the appearance to the group of disciples. It wasn't as good. So empty tomb, appearance to James, not as well attested as, or the evidence isn't quite as strong for them as some of the others. But I don't need them for my case for the resurrection of Jesus anyway.
Gotcha. All right. Thanks so much for staying up with us. Thank you for answering our questions. We really appreciate you coming out. We hope you can do it again. And one day maybe we can have a dinner together where we all witness someone being assaulted with a bottle, and then we can do an empirical investigation and we all have to learn Spanish first, but yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it. Great questions from you all. God bless you. And just a pleasure being with you. We got a cool series going on right now on our YouTube channel. It's called A Fly on the Wall. We premiered our first episode tonight, where I interview Craig Keener. They're only about 15 to 20 minutes long each. Our next one's coming out on Thursday. We've got 4 parts with Craig Keener. We're doing some other cool ones. David Wood, Tim Stratton. We've got a Navy SEAL, former Navy SEAL, who's now in full-time Christian ministry. And then F.F. Bruce's last doctoral student. And we got plenty more after that. So join us on Facebook for those. Go to our channel, and it's pretty cool stuff.
God bless you, Mike.
Take care, guys. God bless you all.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Mike.